Okay, tonight I'm going to get back to some of the kind of meat and potatoes of the course. I want to be talking today, I want to start with the kind of situation where we are now. I've gone over it in some of the early presentations in general terms, talking about where we are now after the most recent election and located on the brink of the 2016 election, and the discussion that we've had about where we are with regard to the end of the Cold War and the issues that started there. What I want to do here is I want to take us from basically where we are now and work our way out in sort of concentric circles to bring you in on more and more of the issues that are unknown and unreported, so that you as a public intellectual are able to comment on these events with access to knowledge that regular people don't have, so that you can assist them in ideally coming to a better understanding of what it is that's going on to cure their confusion. As I've indicated, because of the different worldviews that we've laid out here, it's not to train you to be able to dislodge somebody who's a complete reactionary or authoritarian from their different positions on these things, but it's just to be able to get you to be able to talk to people who are in the sort of middle of the spectrum, who don't quite know what it is that's going on. So I want to be able to work my way out from these concentric circles. I think the most important single thing that we need to look at here, obviously, is the end of the Cold War. And that the Cold War had gone on for approximately 75 years. People keep, the normal media talk about it being a 45-year Cold War that started at the end of World War II with the Soviet Union cranking itself up under Stalin to get ready to take over the world, basically. And that the United States had to, in kind of response to that, put itself out into a larger role in the world of kind of trying to check communist aggression around the world. And that for this 45-year period, between 1945 and 1991 or so, there was this reign of mutual potential destruction against each other. And they actually are indicating that we sort of won out by having that strategy, by threatening to nuke the Soviet Union if they were too aggressive in their imperialist ambitions. And that's the general view that is projected of the Cold War. But I pointed out just in brief in the earlier discussions the fact that the Cold War really began as soon as the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar in Russia and pulled Russia out of World War I and set up the Bolshevik regime in Russia, a self-consciously socialist communist regime that was dialectically declaring the state capitalists of Western culture to be this inveterate enemy of the world. And it was quite clear that they were pushing their kind of ideological chest out into the world and making ominous and kind of threatening noises to the West. But they were ideological rather than military at that time. And so that 75-year period covers that entire Cold War era. And you guys find yourself having been born basically after. How many people here were born before 1992? Okay, but like by how long before 1992 were you born? Yeah, so that actually that you were so small at that time, most of you, that you've grown up your entire life with the Cold War being over. So an experience of the Cold War that the post World War II baby boom generation has, of it basically hanging over us. You've heard a lot about this, kind of the threat of thermonuclear war hanging over us every day of our lives, the potential threat of total nuclear annihilation. Lots of movies about this, raising that kind of ominous threat. Some of them science fiction movies about what it would be like after the end of the world, some of which are more specifically dealing with the kind of craziness of the Cold War and threatened mutual destruction, such as Dr. Strangelove and other movies. But the bottom line is that the place where I think we should start in discussing this with you right now is this point right about when you were born, at the end of the Cold War, because there's a certain set of forces that are going to be manifesting themselves here in your life, as it were, that are reflective of the spectrum that we've talked about, the spectrum of worldviews. But I want to point out some very specific, concrete things, and I've touched on them before, but I want to, beginning tonight, put them into a context that we're going to be discussing these events in for the rest of the course. And that is this, is that very importantly, and I sort of blew through it all in one session, is that as soon as the Central Intelligence Agency had started communicating information to George H.W. Bush, who was the president at the end of the Cold War, on December 31st of 1991, when the actual formal dissolution of the Soviet Union occurred. That when he first started getting indications in June of 1991, June of 1990, that the Soviet Union might well be in the process of disintegrating. That is, Gorbachev taking positions that would allow the Soviet socialist republics to make a decision as to whether or not they wanted to stay as part of the USSR or whether they wanted to establish their own independence. Recall that I told you that George H.W. Bush prepared a memorandum which he sent to Saddam Hussein, a memorandum that George H.W. Bush hand-delivered to April Gillespie, the United States ambassador to Iraq, and made sure that she was to deliver it only in person to Saddam Hussein for his eyes only. And this memo from George H.W. Bush told Saddam Hussein that Bush was aware of the fact that Saddam Hussein was upset over his allegations that the Kuwaiti government was slant drilling under the boundaries of Iraq and stealing Iraqi oil. And George Bush, in this memorandum from June of 1990, told Saddam Hussein that if in fact Saddam Hussein found it necessary to resort to the use of military force against Kuwait, that George H.W. Bush would not view that to be adverse to the long-term best interests of the United States. And so Saddam Hussein, not surprisingly, mobilized his military forces on the border of Kuwait. And at that time, Dick Cheney, a fellow who's going to be a major player in the discussions that we're going to be having for the remainder of the course, as the Secretary of Defense for George H.W. Bush, contacted Prince Bandar, who will also be another major player, to try to understand the unique role that Saudi Arabia plays in a lot of the recent events of history. Cheney, as Secretary of Defense, contacted Prince Bandar as the United States ambassador from Saudi Arabia and invited him to the West Wing and told him that we in the United States had good intelligence data leading us to believe that Saddam Hussein was preparing to invade and occupy Kuwait. And that once he went in and occupied Kuwait, he was going to go on into Saudi Arabia and overthrow the House of Saud and occupy Saudi Arabia. So that was a series of events that took place virtually at the immediately prior to the end of the Cold War. And what was happening there is George H.W. Bush, with Dick Cheney and others like David Addington and Douglas Feith and Elliott Abrams and others, there was an element inside the George H.W. Bush administration that had come to power in 1988, some of whom had been in the administration all the way since 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan, that had what we'll refer to as a particular mindset or a particular worldview, if you will, that there was no doubt at all that these people were more than just regular conservatives. And for some reason, the American news media have found it not to be palatable to refer to them as what they really are, as reactionaries. And so they've referred to them as neoconservatives, like conservatives squared, or conservatives on steroids, if you will. But they're actually reactionaries, which, as I pointed out, is in fact a categorically distinct worldview. But they were inside the George H.W. Bush administration. And they were constantly prepared under the leadership of Dick Cheney to take extreme positions as to what they ought to be doing. So Cheney, as I discussed with you, and I there's one of our little videos that you've got access to, that you can review the details of this that I gave you. As I said, it was a little bit like a drink out of a fire hose. I gave you all the names and the dates and the times, the places that these meetings took place. The bottom line is that George H.W. Bush set up an entire process of instigating Saddam Hussein into going into Kuwait and then utilizing that situation to justify the Saudis inviting the United States to come into the Middle East and occupy the Middle East and bring in our warships and our planes and military troops and establish a no-fly zone in Iraq that required 250,000 United States military personnel to be in full-time occupation of that area in order to safeguard and operate that no-fly zone. And so what happened right there is it instigated a response on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood, the fundamentalist people of Islam, and they basically mounted a jihad against the United States and our allies who had come in there with us, the United Kingdom primarily, and mounted a military operation, paramilitary operation, to oust us using whatever techniques they could, basically engined by a major Mujahideen, heavily armed group who had been armed by the United States Central Intelligence Agency earlier to oust the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. And so that this war on terror that we find ourselves in the midst of right now, that has basically come unglued here and has generated a major paramilitary force in the Middle East, ISIL or ISIS, that is in fact being put on the television virtually every night, threatening to behead another Westerner, and being used by the national news media and the administration and the military to whip up American sentiment into putting more U.S. military personnel into the Middle East to contravene the electoral promise that was made by Osama bin Laden, that if he were elected, he would basically end those wars and withdraw U.S. military forces from the area. And you see this element that I'm talking about, the Dick Cheneys, the reactionaries, they are helping to whip up the fervor in favor of putting more U.S. military personnel in and condemning Osama bin Laden for being weak and taking the military troops out of there, basically slipping completely the fact that they were sent in under complete lies and fabrications, which is pretty much on the public record now about the protestations of W. Bush that he knew that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons and was going to be destroying the world with weapons of mass destruction, and even though I wasn't able to find any, they continued to rationalize the invasion and the occupation with one different rationale after another. But the bottom line is that what's happened now is that you see that Barack Obama's effort to withdraw the troops out of there has been pretty well stymied now by these people, and that they're whipping up the fervor for getting more and more U.S. military troops brought in there. And you see Obama basically now ratcheting up step by step more and more U.S. military forces under one particular rubric or another to go in to just protect the Afghan troops, to train the Afghan troops, now to supply the air cover for the operations of the Afghan troops, to supply drones for the Afghan troops, and now almost openly putting in U.S. military forces that are going to be going into the field with Afghan troops, with the authority that if they're shot at, that they have a right to gather more U.S. military troops to help defend them. So you can see that this element has been very effective in instigating this war in the Middle East, the occupation of the Middle Eastern oil fields, in that they've generated up another ultimate other to take the place of the Soviet Union now. And so that we find ourselves, our generation and your generation, now faced with this daily situation. If you were to go home tonight, and if you've TiVoed the news and you put on any one or more of the major news stations, and CBS, NBC, or ABC, or CNN, that you can bet that almost half of the stories are going to be about this activity in the Middle East. And virtually all of it, when you sit back and listen to it, you say, now what is it they want me to think? What is it they want me to feel? And you see where it is they're driving you. They're trying to drive you into sympathizing with the elements that are now advocating putting more U.S. military troops into the Middle East to fight this horrible ISIS that's right out of central casting as a whole group of horrible, terrible bad guys. So that's the situation that we find ourselves in, as sort of the core of the concentric circle that we're talking about when we're talking about real politics and what's going on. There was another element that I pointed out to you that immediately after the formal end of the Cold War, on December 31st of 1991, that this group of people with Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and David Addington and Elliot Abrams and Douglas Feith, and they gathered in the West Wing and in the first week of January of 1992 and drafted this thing I told you about, this first draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, in which they flatly advocated the United States military to crank up and to establish full spectrum dominance throughout the world, to take advantage of this unique moment at the end of the Cold War when we were the sole superpower on the planet, to move into place to establish full-scale military dominion over the entire world. And and to also justify taking unilateral U.S. military action to crush any type of attempt on the part of any nation state or any organized group to prepare themselves militarily to provide any type of effective resistance to the United States military anywhere in the world. And you'll recall that what happened is that when a copy of that got leaked to the Washington Post and the New York Times, editorials were written against it, and George H.W. Bush, still the sitting president, announced that he was in fact doing another draft of that. And he drafted a second alternative draft, which is called the Projection of U.S. Military Power into the 21st Century and Beyond. And he advocated establishing a new alliance to supersede the United Nations, to basically police the post-Cold War world. He proposed establishing a new alliance among the United States, Canada, Mexico under the PRI, governed by the Castilian Spanish, the United Kingdom, France, Spain, and the new reunified Germany, and actually proposed inviting Russia in, quote, now that Russia has spun off all of its ethnic provinces, making it abundantly clear that what they were talking about was in fact a Caucasian, a Western alliance to actually run the world, which the term for which he actually coined the New Northern Industrial Alliance, as he called it. And he specifically stated in the document that the objective of this New Northern Industrial Alliance was to maintain the continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials needed by members of the Northern Industrial Alliance. So, what you see there is this group of people that were all supportive of this first draft, then becoming quite distressed that George H.W. Bush had kind of backed off when it was exposed, the first draft, and was criticized as blatant Western imperialism, and backed off, George Bush Sr. backed off and came in with this proposal that this new alliance include virtually all of the Caucasian nations of the Northern Hemisphere, and that we work in tandem together to establish full spectrum dominance around the world. So that's what you see going on. The debate, the primary debate that's been allowed now in the post-war period is a debate between the advocates of unilateral United States military hegemony in the world, or are doing so as the leader of a Northern Industrial Alliance, which includes all of the major Caucasian states, even though now they've abandoned that hope, at least temporarily, of having Russia join with them because of Putin's positions of not being willing to go along with this, and then the United States utilizing NATO to start inviting the former republics of the Soviet Union, the Caucasian republics, to become part of NATO, and starting to surround Russia, and so that Putin is now pushed back, and that we have the problems like we have in the Ukraine and other places. But what I'm trying to describe right now is just sort of what the central concentric circle is that we find ourselves in right now at this moment. Because what I want to do, once we've gotten that done here, is I want to go to the next concentric circle, and I want to point out that the people who were participating in the instigating of the war in the Middle East, the occupation of the Middle Eastern oil fields, in the George H.W. Bush administration with Cheney and the others, were in fact the same people who in fact drafted up this initial draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, proposing the establishment of full spectrum dominance around the world. And that these particular people, in fact, are adherents to a reactionary worldview. And as I pointed out again briefly in our earlier talks, this second paradigm worldview, this reactionary worldview that we talked about here, the paradigmatic manifestation of this worldview in our recent history, that is within the lifetimes of people in the room here, some of the older people here, is that this has been the Third Reich of the German government. The German Third Reich was a paradigmatic reactionary administration, and they followed a particular ideology that has been called fascism. And fascism is a very specific thing that we want to talk about in this course, because one of the things that you'll see is that there's been all down through the last almost 75 to 100 years of the intellectual community in the West, that there's been this kind of rampant contempt for fascism. Now, many of the public intellectuals and and leading intellectuals in the world, in Western civilization, have been accused of being socialists or communists or anarchists or subversives of one form or another, but it's primarily because they have in common this anti-fascist set of beliefs that they've actually gotten. Many of them have gotten caught in a dialectic, ironically enough, with the fascists. The fascists are reactionaries. The fascists are driven by a dialectic. They identify communists and socialists as the ultimate other. They view themselves as the advocates of Christian, Caucasian, nation-state-based capitalism. They like to use the term democratic capitalism around the world with an emphasis on capitalism. And that the public intellectuals have taken to criticizing them and characterizing them in certain ways, always with this undertone of suggesting that the people that they're criticizing are fascists. And what I want to do is I want to tell you that they're right. That's what we're dealing with in this course, is that the real challenge that public intellectuals have is having to come to grips with the fact that there is a major fascist movement in Western civilization that is constantly attempting to establish kind of these fascist dictatorial states, and that they're constantly using the threat of socialism or communism or subversion as the ultimate other that they're attempting to use to justify their establishing kind of totalitarian policies inside their domestic areas. And that's what's happening here. And so what I want to do is I want to deal with this so that I can at least share with you what it is I've come to discover. When I was in Harvard College and law school and divinity school and stuff like that, we were engaged in opposing the war, and we knew that the United States was engaged in a major imperialist venture. But it was kind of an up close personal thing. You can tell that it's an imperialist venture. That Ho Chi Minh, we found out in Vietnam, had been opposing the French when they were in there, and the United States was basically taking over the French colony in Indochina. And so that because we so much wanted to resist being dragged all the way over into the jungles of Vietnam and having to be put into a war with people whose families had lived there for 1,000 generations, that we began to do a deeper analysis and come to understand that it's quite clear that the United States was engaged in attempting to take over a colonial mission that had been undertaken initially in Indochina by France. And that it drove us, not because we were being taught any of these things in college at the academy, but it drove us to have to start looking at what was really going on there. How did the French end up in there to begin with? And what else was going on in the world at that time when the French went in 1898 with a big warship into the harbor in Saigon and basically laid siege to the city and took it. And what was it that was going on? That there was an entire era of imperialism that was going on in that time. And it drove us to have to go back in and look at that period. And what happened is our generation started coming to an insight that the United States was engaged in this kind of major imperial venture and had been doing so since basically at the end of the American Civil War. And they sort of came on through that period, as I mentioned, from 1868 to 1898, when they find themselves in kind of full flower under the whip hand of the robber barons, engaged in these imperial ventures. And so what I want to do is I want to suggest that even though throughout that entire period, because I was caught up at being at Harvard College and the law school and going to work for the law firms in New York and all of that, I never quite accepted, at least I never quite adopted, what I thought was a kind of a simplistic and not carefully examined position on the part of some of the more radical student movements at the time, such as the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society. And there were other groups like the Communist Workers' Party and they had the Socialists of America. There were a whole bunch of different groups that were, in a sense, vying for the loyalty of our generation to come to a particular political analysis of what it was that the United States was really doing. And I was very much into the academy and caught in the academy wake. And so I was forced kind of incident by incident by incident by incident to keep on discovering kind of de novo what the actual evidence was that was step by step convincing me that in fact some of the most radical analysis of what it is the United States was really doing and who was really causing it to be done began to become more and more clear to me, to the point where when we got involved in the Iran-Contra investigation, that kind of single most important moment occurred when I was asked by Dick Billings, the chief research director for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, to come and meet a particular guy that was Joseph Burkholder Smith that I told you about, that I met with at the Dubliner Cafe. And when he started talking to me about being concerned for my safety, since I was investigating this group that was behind the Iran-Contra scandal and that had actually filed a major federal litigation against them and was basically going around to the different college campuses, pounding away at these people and talking about the fact that they were engaged in a whole set of violations of international law and that they were actually mounting a criminal war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, directly contrary to the orders of Congress. I began when I went to meet Joseph Burkholder Smith, he told me that story that I've told you. And I'll repeat it to you briefly again so you have it fresh in your mind. That is that I walk into the Dubliner Cafe and Dick Billings, who would come to my office to meet me, brings me over and he says, Dan Sheehan, Joe Smith. And I reached out my hand, I shook his hand, I said, yeah, right, Joe Smith. And he said, no, I get that a lot with Joe Smith. My name is Joseph Burkholder Smith, and I was the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City in 1973 when Theodore Shackley, who is another major character that we're going to be talking about a lot in the remainder of this course, that Theodore Shackley, who was the CIA station chief in Saigon, was taken by the CIA out of Saigon and removed and brought to the United States and was put in charge of the Western Hemisphere operations for the agency. And at that point, he in fact dismissed all of the station chiefs of all of the Latin American stations, saying that in fact Phil Agee, a member of the Central Intelligence Agency, was in the process of writing a book in which he was going to be possibly naming names, and he may well be in possession of the names, the real names of the station chiefs all through Western Hemisphere. And so therefore he was going to replace all of them and put in his own people. And he put a man in charge of the Mexico City station by the name of Tom Polgar. And Tom Polgar, according to Joseph Smith, came into Joseph Smith's office the day after he arrived there, and he said, Joe, I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep you on here as my deputy, but there's going to be a guy coming in to see you tomorrow morning around 10 o'clock. When he comes to the office, you'll recognize who he is, and he's going to ask you some questions. And depending upon how you answer those questions, that will really determine whether you're going to be left on here as my deputy. He said he may even want to bring you to meet some other people who will have some questions for you. And depending upon how you answer those questions, that will determine whether you're going to be left on. The next morning, he said, about 10 o'clock in the morning, into his office walks Nasser Haro, the head of the DFS in Mexico, which is like the combined FBI and CIA of Mexico. He comes in and he says, Joe, I imagine that Polgar told you that I was coming. There's some people I'd like to have you come meet, and they've got some questions for you. And depending upon how you answer these questions, that may determine whether you're going to be left on as the deputy CIA station chief here in Mexico City. So he takes him downstairs, and they get in this little Suburban with the smoke glass windows and drive to the Mexico City airport, go completely around all the security, get into a Learjet, and they fly away. And they fly away, and they fly and fly and fly, and they end up landing in Buenos Aires. And he gets out of the Learjet, and they go all around the security at the airport. And this is now 1986 that this is happening. This is happening in June of 1986. This meeting takes place about June 3rd. And so he says that, this is back in 1973, he's telling me about now. And he said that he in fact was flown, he got out of the airplane and he followed Nasser Haro, and they got in this helicopter. And the helicopter flies away and flies way up to the northwestern corner of Argentina, where Argentina comes together with 2 or 3 other major South American countries up there. And it lands on what looks like a soccer field. He said, and I get out of the helicopter and I follow Nasser Haro across the soccer field and up this embankment. And I got up to the top of the embankment. And I looked over, and he said, and I thought I was in Bavaria, he said. And Nasser Haro takes him down into the little Bavarian-like village to this little Bavarian inn. And he walks in, and here are these 6 men sitting at a big, huge, like dark oak table, like. And he said, and the 6 of them were sitting there, and there was a chair on the other side, a single chair. They gestured for him to sit down in the chair, and he sits down. And the man in the middle says, Joe, he said, now you know there's some question about whether you're going to be left on here as the deputy station chief in Mexico City. And we just wanted to tell you that we've gone to a great deal of trouble to set up a major cocaine cartel down in Medellin in Colombia. And this cocaine is going to be being smuggled in from South America into the United States. And a portion of those profits are going to be used to help fight your enemies and ours in our war without boundaries. And we want to make certain that if you're going to be left on as the deputy station chief, that you aren't going to do anything to interfere with that. And then he stopped and he said to me, and Dan, I want to tell you, I swear to God, he said, I don't know what I'd ever done in my life that would have led them to believe that I would have gone along with that. And I said, how about being the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City for a beginning, I said. And then he went, and he got really kind of taken aback by it. And he kind of got up and he looked over at Dick Billings. He said, I thought he was going to cooperate with us on this. And Billings just looked at him and said, hey, look, I just met the guy. He said, so he gets up and he comes all the way around the table and he holds his hand out to me like that to leave. And I reach up and take his hand and he shakes my hand and he looks down at me and he says, I just wanted to let you know if you're going to be doing a case against these people, who it is you're really dealing with. Okay? That was an extraordinarily important moment in my entire kind of political education. Because here I was thinking I was pretty smart and I was, chasing these bad guys around and we had them cornered and I named all these guys in this federal complaint. And, I've been having meetings with Tip O'Neill and I'd had, meetings with Joe Biden, and I was briefing guys in Congress about this. And yet I was now being told that there was a dimension to the people that we were confronting that was one that I hadn't really expected. And he was telling me that there were these fascists that were down in Latin America and Mexico City that were working cheek and jowl with our Central Intelligence Agency people there. And it set me on an entirely deeper course of investigation to determine who these people were, what their background was, and what I discovered is what I'm going to tell you about now. It turns out that these people all track from right at the very end of World War II in 1945. In 1945, when the Russians had defeated the 5th and 6th Army of Germany in 1943, As I mentioned to you earlier, the Japanese had already surrendered by this time, by August of 1945. I take it, but the European war was still going on. I take it, and what happened is that all of the major high command in Germany realized that they were not going to be able to win the war by mid 1944, and so that what happened is that a fellow by the name of Reinhard Gehlen, who was a major general in the Third Reich's army, he was the commander of anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence for the Third Reich. He, knowing that the Third Reich was going to lose this war, he microfilmed all of the records in the anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc division of his intelligence division and put them into these barrels, and then took the microfilms in the barrels up into the Bavarian mountains and dug a big trench in this meadow and buried them. And he stayed there with a few of his close confidants until the end of the war, until the German Nazi Third Reich government surrendered to the Allied forces. And immediately upon the surrender of the Germans, Reinhard Gehlen, in a United States private's army uniform, marched down into where the 101st Counterintelligence Corps was in Germany and turned himself in and told them that, I am Reinhard Gehlen. I am the commander of the German Third Reich's anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence, and I'm offering you my services. I've surrendered now. You guys need to know, because we know, that now your major adversary is going to not be us, it's going to be Russia and the Soviet Union. They're the ones that you need to deal with. We attempted to stop them as Germans. We realized that we were just a force, a bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe, and that you're going to have to deal with them. I'll come work for you. And he had assigned to him 2 German-American translators that were in the 101st Counterintelligence Corps. And these 2 men were Theodore G. Shackley and Henry Kissinger. And these young men in the 101st Counterintelligence Corps of the U.S. Army came and met with Reinhard Gehlen and became his translators. And Theodore Shackley became his dominant translator and actually went with him, with Reinhard Gehlen. He was taken to the United States, and at a place called Fort Hunt, outside of Washington, D.C. He spent 2 weeks in these protracted negotiations with the people that were in the OSS and Army intelligence. And they had these long meetings, and he pitched a proposal to them through his translator, Theodore Shackley, of offering to head up the post-World War II German intelligence network in East Germany, or in West Germany, that was going to be the half of Germany that the Allied powers were going to administer, knowing that the Soviet Union was going to be administering the Eastern Bloc. And so that he offered to do that if, in fact, they would allow 100 of his men to be taken off the Nuremberg war crimes list and allowed to serve with him there. And the United States High Command and the OSS, they made an agreement to do that, to allow him to run the intelligence services of West Germany. And a group of people were assigned from the United States to be there in Berlin, in the Berlin Operating Bureau. They call it, the Berlin Operating Bureau is BOB, they call them, the people from BOB, they call them. And you'll hear about these guys a lot, because there are about 8 or 10 men who were assigned by the elite intelligence community in the United States, in the military, and the civilian people around them, who were in that office. And what they did is they worked very closely with John McCloy, who was assigned to be the Governor General in West Germany. And what they did is they emphasized trying to get back into establishing good, solid relations with the German remnants of the governing powers in Germany. And it turns out that for a lot of them, that wasn't that hard an assignment for them. Guys like Alan Dulles, for example, who in fact was the lawyer for the German high command after World War I, who was in charge of making sure that the reparations were paid by the German government that were set forth in the Treaty of Versailles. And there were a group of these people. And it's not true that these Americans based there in Berlin simply went native and somehow got in to be too close with the German high command. The fact of the matter is that these people shared a fascist ideology with the Germans, the same ideology that had engined the entire Third Reich, a whole panoply of issues that we'll deal with that go into making up a fascist perspective on things. And that what we're going to be discussing in the class here is how this ideology of fascism that was existent in that Berlin operating base and in Reinhard Gehlen's organization has in fact manifested itself in a completely back channel, off-the-shelf, concealed ruling elite in our country that in fact have been secretly governing from the shadows, not only from the end of World War II, but we'll deal later with larger concentric circles that show that this dates back even earlier, all the way into the founding of our country. And then in larger concentric circles, that it in fact dates back prior to the founding of the country, dealing with the concepts of royalism and the ecclesial elite that ruled Europe and their anti-democratic sentiments. Okay, and so that this is the series of concentric circles, or a Chinese puzzle box, that we're going to be unpacking here in the course as we go through it. But as I said, what I wanted to do is I wanted to start at the center of the concentric circles, so that you would resonate with some familiarity with the issues that obtain at the present time, with the issue of the ISIL and the Al-Qaeda and the war on terrorism and the invasion and occupation of the Middle Eastern oil fields and all of the repercussions that has now. And what I want to do is I want to focus in the next class that we have, and I won't be able to be here on Friday. I have to leave tomorrow morning first thing for Washington, D.C. We're actually meeting on Wednesday. The tribal chairmen from the 9 Sioux tribes of South Dakota are going to be meeting along with the other tribal chairmen around the country with Barack Obama. And then we're going to be meeting on Thursday with the new Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the new head of the Federal Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to basically get an agreement finalized that the federal government is going to be shifting $65 million a year away from the state of South Dakota to the 9 tribes in South Dakota, with which to set up and fund and operate their own child and family services agencies, to stop the state of South Dakota from seizing their children and taking them away and putting them in white foster care group homes and drugging them with major pharmaceuticals and stuff that we've found them doing. So I will be there for the week, and so I won't be available for the Wednesday office hours or for Friday. But the following Monday when I come back, what I want to do is I want to pick up this theme, because I want to focus your attention, to have you start thinking in terms of these concentric circles. And the tightest concentric circle I want you to focus on is the one that happened from the right at the time, like around when you were born, at the very end of the Cold War, when this kind of reactionary group inside the George H.W. Bush administration both instigated the invasion and occupation of the Middle Eastern oil fields, instigating this war on terrorism and characterizing these Islamic fundamentalists as this ultimate other that was the rationale for all types of repressive measures taken here in the United States, such as the passing of the Patriot Act and the generation of massive electronic surveillance, the renditioning of people without any trials, the torturing and waterboarding of people, this entire regime that you now have become familiar with, that you want to be able to track that from the borders of that concentric circle that started right at the end of World War, or the Cold War, okay? And just to let you know that what we're going to be doing is looking inside that box of what all the indications are that there's something wrong here, that there's something going on here very different from what it is that you're being told by all the media, including the New York Times, basically in almost all of the courses that you'll study at the academy, by all of the news media, the electronic news media virtually, okay? And you're seeing some flickers of this on Frontline, because there's a fabulous guy by the name of Lowell Bergman. Lowell Bergman is the professor of investigative journalism at Berkeley. And he is the executive director, or executive producer of Frontline. And so you see these periodic shows on Frontline that actually are quite penetrating in revealing information like up in front of you that you didn't know was there. It's not strategic, but it sure does give you a better tactical perspective of things going on that you didn't know about. But for the most part, 99% of all of the media coverage that you see or hear is telling you a false story about what it is that's actually going on. So what we'll do is we'll talk about the story inside this first concentric circle that operates from the time that you were born, basically. That's taking you being born around 1991 or so, right at the end of the Cold War. Okay, and I want to examine that first, and then we'll step into the larger concentric circle that goes back to the end of World War II. Then we'll get to the larger concentric circle that goes back to the end of World War I. And then we'll go to the larger concentric circle that covers the lead into World War I, that basically goes all the way from the end of the Civil War, from 1868, up to the beginning of the First World War. Okay, so these are the concentric circles. And I want to make clear that this is not just simply intended to be a course on world history. That's not what this is. All of this is in this larger context of trying to help train you to be public intellectuals, to come to understand what the grist of the mill is that you're going to be dealing with in part, which is all part of the two-piece major crisis that I'm talking about. And that is, as you know, the onset of the global climate change, but at the same time, the building up of this massive national security state apparatus that is going to roll into place and to be able to quell any type of major public disturbances that arise because of the disruption generated by the massive global climate change. So we're focusing on this, the rise of this major national security state, and trying to understand what its origins are, because it's going to be up to you to be able to talk about this. And I want you, if you will, between now and next Monday, I want you to do two things. If you can, see if you can get a copy of The American Deep State. This is by Peter Dale Scott. Peter Dale Scott is one of the great researchers of our time. And he has come up with an analysis of this deep state with which I'll be taking some issues. but it's a good basic text to work from here. Okay, so do a copy of this, and I also want you to find out about a group if you haven't heard of them yet. Two groups actually, and we'll talk about it some when we get back together again next Monday. I'll make a note here to do it. That the one is a group called the White Rose. And the other is a group called the Chippewa. Okay, the White Rose in Germany back in the 1920s, and the other one is the Chippewa, that were a South American group of college students and law students, actually, who gathered and rose up to try to push back the fascists in South America. Okay, because one of the things I want to do is I want to start you thinking about things that you can think about and do and say that has to do with starting to become a public intellectual, dealing with this national security state that you see presently in power here in the United States now.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
How do you spell the
Chippewa?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's Tippamarro or something like that. You'll get it if you Google it. You'll get it. The Chippewa. And I think it was in. Do you remember where it was? Was in Ecuador or what country was that? The Chippewa in Uruguay. I think it was Uruguay. Okay. I think you'll find it in Uruguay. But I want you to find out about both of those groups because I want you to start seeing what could have been added to their efforts that public intellectuals such as yourselves could have assisted in. Okay? So what is the role of the public intellectual in confronting the rise of a fascist oligarchy in their country? Okay? And we'll pick that up when we come back on next Monday. And so just get a chance to get a read of the American deep state and do a little bit of checking up and finding about the White Rose and the Chippewa. All right, and then I'll see you on Monday. And my apologies for being gone. I really would like to maintain kind of regular class schedules and stuff, and I apologize, but this was the only time we could get to see all of those people in one week's sitting. Okay, great. Thank you very much.